microphone's not switched on. Focusing on myself instead of on the background. Right. Okay. Religion. So, sorry, my phone is in my pocket. Okay. Oh, that's better. I was inspired to make this video by a question that gets asked a fair amount to Viking Age reenactors, which is, do you follow the Old Norse gods? And it seems to be a weirdly Viking Age specific thing. If you reenact another period, let me know if this happens to you, but there seems to be this really Viking Age specific idea that if you dress up in the clothes of the person that died 1,000 years ago, you must also subscribe to their philosophy. And I don't think it happens to Roman legionary reenactors where people come and ask them if they're Mithraists. I don't think high medieval reenactors, people assume that they're all fervent Roman Catholics, with the possible exception of Crusades reenactors. Let me know below. But it always kind of ends up jumping to the next conclusion, which is, oh, but the Vikings hated the Christians, didn't they? And I thought that this deserved a video. Actually, I decided to do a two-parter because I would like to go into a bit of depth with this one, if that's okay with you, and because I like to keep my videos fairly short and sweet, like 15-20 minutes long. I didn't really want to be doing an hour-long video essay. As much as anything, I don't think my laptop could cope with having that much footage on it. So this first video, we're going to look at some background. Just checking I'm still in focus. We're going to look at some background to the religious situation in Northern and Northwestern Europe, and we're going to also look at some of the religious and political things that happen that have caused people to assume that the Vikings must have hated the Christians. So let's do some background. So this background starts with the Roman Empire, and by the time the Roman Empire is on its arse in the mid-5th century, so in the 400s, they have been a Christian state for a little while here. And prior to that, they basically had 300 years of bullying Christians. So when the Christians first arrive in the 1st century as a Jewish sect, they are persecuted because they refuse to pay tribute to the emperor. The emperor is considered a god, and they have only one god, so they refused, and so they threw them to the lions. And human beings and other animals, but, you know, lions was a good one. Once the Emperor Constantine converts and has a deathbed baptism to Christianity, he legalizes Christianity in the empire. After him, a few decades later, Theodosius I, in the 4th century, makes paganism illegal. He basically outlaws pagan practices in Rome, so they remove the Statue of Victory from the Senate House. The Vestal fire is quenched, you can't go to the Vestal Virgins for advice anymore, you can't make sacrifices at a lararium anymore, you basically can't be a practicing pagan, and that's very unpopular with pagan Romans, and it's very popular with Christian Romans. So in the next couple of hundred years, the Roman Empire in the West basically trips over its own testicles and falls down the stairs. The Eastern Empire that becomes the Byzantine Empire is kind of toddling along semi-happily, speaking Greek and drinking ouzo and all of that kind of stuff, and developing the Cyrillic alphabet and spreading Orthodox Christianity to the East. What happens in the West is all of these barbarian tribes invade, so the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and that sort of thing, and they sack Rome in 455 and come into contact with Christianity. And Roman Christianity in this period already has things like bishops and priests and churches and, you know, long services around baptism and funerary rites and that kind of thing. And as time goes on, what's known as the Gaulish Church, so basically the Roman Church in France, carries on spreading Christianity around there. Germanic peoples then move in from the east, including the Franks. Now, it's important to note at this point that there is no united Germanic identity at this period. There is no such thing. There are lots of different Germanically cultural tribes. There are lots of culturally Germanic tribes, and there is a Germanic pagan religion, but there is no single Germanic entity. You have things like the Franks, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Longobards, people like that, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Angles. Germanic, not all the same. The big thing that seems to unite a lot of these Germanic tribes is they follow a polytheistic religion. So they've got lots of gods, Christianity's only got one god. You can see where this is going to start to go wrong. And the Franks in basically northeastern France become the big daddy of the kingdoms that survive the Roman Empire in the West. This is the sort of the power base that starts to develop, is the Frankish kingdom. And as time goes on, their kings convert to Christianity. Pepin of Herstal is one of these Frankish leaders who is a Christian, and in the 7th century encourages missionaries to go into Friesland. And Frisia, Magna Frisia, the Frisian kingdom, is a specialist subject of history with Hilbert, so go on over to Hilbert's channel. It's where he's from. He is Fries, and he's a specialist on it. He's really, really good. Go and learn some more about that, because it is a fascinating place with a fascinating history, especially in this period. But you get people like Willibrord, who is a missionary. He's an Anglo-Saxon missionary, and Willibrord goes from Britain down to Rome, gets made a bishop, goes back up via the Franks, gets some cash and stone and help from Herstal, goes into Frisia, builds Utrecht Cathedral. So by the 7th century, we have a cathedral in Germanic territory, in Frisian territory. And at various points, Willibrord does really well. At various points, he's forced to flee because the Franks invade and people rise up against the Franks and their perceived Christian, puppets. So it's up and down for missionaries like Willibrord. Later on, people like Wilfrid turn up, and then people like Ansgar turn up. And this is the situation for basically the next 200 years, from the middle of the 600s to the middle of the 800s. The Franks, the Christian Franks, take Christianity and run with it. And they can do that because of a bit of a philosophical difference. Now, Christianity is one of the two religions in Western Europe that is big and monotheistic and monolithic. The other one is Islam, because after the 710s, the Umayyad Caliphate sweeps through North Africa, conquers Spain. So you've got Christianity and Islam massively influential in Western Europe. And they have a very distinct philosophy from these polytheistic religions. Effectively, that philosophy is, our God is the only God and we're worshipping the right way. You're all wrong, and if you don't change, you'll be punished, either here or in the next life. That's not the philosophy that we get from many of the other polytheistic religions. For instance, there were temples to Egyptian gods in Rome. There were temples to Roman gods in Egypt. There were temples to Greek gods in Egypt, and vice versa. These classical religions were all pretty loosey-goosey as long as you weren't hurting anybody or trying to force anyone to change their views. And that seems to have continued in the Germanic pagan religions. So what did these pagan Germanic people actually believe in? Well, we're not 100% sure. We know that they had similar gods to the later Old Norse. We know that Charlemagne, when he turns up at the end of the 8th century, commits a heinous act against them by cutting down the Irminsul. The Irminsul is basically a sacred tree. Now, the Irminsul's specific purpose is lost to time. It survives as an element in German folklore for centuries. The Brothers Grimm mention it at one point or another. There are pictures of them from the 1600s and the 16th century, but we're not sure if it was used in the same way as some other Germanic totems, where it's a place where you meet and the priest does the ritual and the sacrifice. That's probably what it is, but we can't say for sure that's what it is. This is just me being a typical archaeologist and saying we have evidence that points to this, instead of saying this is what was done, because that is how I was taught, and I am fine with nuance. It's nuance, baby! Cutting down sacred groves and baptizing people in sacred springs and wells is a really common thing that Christian missionaries and evangelists do. Basically, they are defacing this site. They're basically, laughing in the face of the pagan god whose site this is by saying, yeah, well, I'm going to use it for my own purposes. I'm going to build a chapel on your sacred grove. I'm going to baptize somebody in your sacred well. Now it belongs to me. And Charlemagne's big mistake here is he is fighting a war. This isn't just he goes in, he subjugates. He is fighting a war against the Saxon tribes. A man called Widukind is giving him serious problems for decades at this point. And in the 770s, 80s and 90s, the Saxon wars are really dragging on. You start seeing churches being burnt down, missionaries have to flee, even established missionaries in places like Bremen and Hamburg have to flee their churches at various points. Charlemagne effectively doubles down. He brings in a law called the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae. 2 semesters of Latin, not wasted. And this is basically punitive legislation that says if you are a Saxon and you're baptised and you go back on that baptism and start worshipping your devils again, you're punished by death. So effectively, convert or die by law. This is seriously brutal theocratic legislation here. He is actually saying, follow my religion or die. And it doesn't go down terribly well. What goes down even worse is that he suffers a defeat in battle, and somewhere around 782 to 795 massacres 4,500 people at a place called Verden. And that is pretty barefaced religious persecution on a large scale. Now, so far we've got lots of stuff about Charlemagne being horrible and Christians being awful, but surely some people were converting of their own accord. And yeah, they do seem to have been. A man called Harald Klak converts to Christianity. He's king of Denmark in the 9th century. He comes down to Charlemagne's son, a man called Louis the Pious, no guessing what his opinions were, and he basically asks for military aid. Louis says, yeah, sure thing, I'd rather have you as an ally than an enemy. Harald goes up and at various points succeeds. Eventually he's deposed, flees south to the Franks, converts to Christianity, and baptizes himself with 400 followers. At this point we need to discuss baptism. So baptism can be a very honest, genuine spiritual experience. It can also be really cynical in this period. If you've ever played Crusader Kings, you'll know that if you win a war, you can force conversion of somebody to your religion. And that's basically what people were doing. It's a really good illustration of medieval Europe, actually, Crusader Kings 3. God, I love that game. Please sponsor me. People like Harald Klak, people like Rollo, who settles Normandy with his Viking chums, and then eventually they become Normans, and they become French and Frankified and Christianized. They both are baptized. They have godfathers. Lothair is the godfather of Harald Klak's son, who then becomes a Viking again and raids both pagan and Christian sites. And one of the cynical reasons for baptism is you are a petty chieftain in Norway. You are forced to raid. You are forced to raid. Using your longships, using your people as raiders, when what you really want is some stability, some wealth, and some power. All of a sudden, you turn up in Frisia, and an emissary of the emperor of the Romans, comes to you and says, we'll give you a sackload of silver, 200 acres, and you'll have our full military support against any enemies that incur on your land. In exchange, you defend this territory from Viking raiders, and you convert to Christianity. What do you say? I say, hell yes, thank you very much. Where do I sign? Is what a lot of people seem to have been saying. So, yes, there is this real fire and sword Christianization coming from Charlemagne, especially after in 800 he is crowned Emperor of the Romans. Like, that doubles down his authority. He has authority from God via the Pope, God's mouth on earth, to defend the faith of the entire Roman Empire as was, which also gives him a good excuse to start pressing eastwards across the Rhine so that he can reconquer Roman territory. But you also have this diplomatic conversion to Christianity. Now, does that mean that all these people were fervent, passionate Christians for the rest of their lives? No, of course it doesn't. We don't know that. We don't know that at all. The only times we know that is if we then get evidence from their biographies that says, and then he did all of this really cool Christian stuff. Like, he did all of this amazing stuff. He built churches and cathedrals and became a monk and all this kind of thing. Otherwise, we don't know. And chances are, the majority of the time, it's somewhere in the middle. So, we already mentioned earlier on that a chap called Boniface turns up, and this is towards the end of Charlemagne's reign into the reign of his son, Louis the Pious, and his name is Boniface. It's a great name. He goes to Frisia as a missionary. He then goes to one of the islands, we're not sure which, and chops down a sacred grove. Big mistake. He chops down the sacred grove, he does some blessings in the sacred spring. He then goes back to the mainland and says, right, we're going to do a mass baptism. Anyone who wants to turn up, he'll get dunked. Lots of people turn up, all armed, and they kill him. There are a lot of stories of reprisals against missionaries. Sometimes we get the whole story, like with Boniface, where we can go, well, what were you expecting? And sometimes all we get is, and then the pagans rose up and they burnt our church and we were forced to flee. And you're a bit like, did you chop down the sacred groves? Did you? Alright. But then equally, a couple of years later, these missionaries always come back again, like Ansgar flees, I think in 816 for a couple of years. In 819, he's back up in Birka, he's building a new church, he's proselytizing, he's preaching away, he's having a wonderful time. Like, these people just, every now and then, have to go, whoop, pack my bags. And then they come back. So there does seem to be an element in these communities that are welcoming these people back, right? It would be difficult for you to go back and everybody hates you. So there is definitely some nuance to the situation. Take a drink every time I say nuance in these videos. Do it. It's the new Welsh Viking drinking game. Every time he says nuance, crap. Take a sip. I'm glad this isn't Irish dub. Woo! So you'll already know this from some of my other videos, but I like nuance. It's nuance, baby. 99% of people are somewhere in the middle. And in this period, I heavily suspect that the Saxon Wars are raging. Yes, Frisian people are uprising against Charlemagne, but I suspect that an awful lot of people just wanted to get on with the harvest. Like, a lot of people would clock the banners that the invading army was flying and make sure they said the right thing. Because so much territory changes hands so frequently in this period, it's very difficult to gauge what the average person was thinking. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to make this a two-parter, and this first part is going to end somewhere in the middle of the 9th century, where we have the death of Charlemagne, his territory is being split amongst his sons, and we also have people like Ansgar, who is a prominent missionary who has built cathedrals and monasteries in Germany. He's gone up to Birka in Sweden, for goodness sake. And we have people like Harald Klak, who brings monks up to Denmark with him when he becomes king of Denmark. Now, a lot of these attempts at Christianizing are unsuccessful for various reasons. Like we've just said, there are cynical things happening, there are optimistic things happening. Some of these people will have gone up to Birka, preached the word of Christianity, and people will have gone, that sounds fantastic, yeah, I'm in. Some of them may have struggled with the concept that you can't worship God, the Christian God, and God, all of my Old Norse pagan gods at the same time, because I've had loads of gods, why can't I just have one more? So, we're going to look a bit more in depth into that side of things in part 2, where missionaries are struggling to convert Old Norse people are converting themselves, and some of the really big stuff, like, what about the Vikings who came over to Britain and Ireland, which had very large, very devout Catholic Christian populations already? What happens to them, and what archaeology are they leaving behind? So I really hope you enjoyed this first part. I'm certainly enjoying reading up on it. If there's any of this that you'd like an in-depth video on, like Charlemagne or the rise of the Franks and the Frankish kingdoms, please do let me know. Do go and check out History with Hilbert's channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel financially, feel free to pop over to the Ko-fi or the Patreon page. I always need caffeination to edit these things, and my Patreons, you guys are literally keeping the lights on. Like, there's a reason I am this well exposed in this video, and it's because you're helping me pay my bills, because you rock, and you're so sound. It's a really cool system. As Blind Boy puts it, it's based on soundness. And if you'd like to and you can afford to, I'd love you to join the Patreon. If you can't, don't worry about it, because the people who can afford to are, and that's amazing of you, and I genuinely appreciate it. So diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this. Part 2 coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Tan y tro nesa, till the next time, hwyl fawr. Bye-bye. This is definitely like a 2 cup of tea video.